You'll be working on 5.4, factor and solve polynomial equations. Now we're going to start off with number 2. The first 4 questions are a review of something of what we've covered before Christmas break, so hopefully you remember. If you look at example 2, we're looking for the factors of 16 that sum up to 8. Factors of 16 are 1 and 16, 2 and 8, and 4 and 4. When you add those, who's going to add up to 8? The 4 and 4. Therefore, our answer would be x plus 4 and x plus 4. In example 1, this one has a leading coefficient, a number in front. So we need to make sure that we multiply that number times the last number. And by the way, please fix this mistake. That 3 should actually be an exponent of 2. So once you multiply that 2 times a negative 20, we get negative 40. So we're looking for the factors of negative 40 that add up to a negative 3. Factors of 40 are 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 4 and 10, and 5 and 8. Because it's a negative 40, that should tell me my numbers should be different signs. I look at the middle number, it's negative, so that means my larger number should be negative. When I do the summation there, the only ones that give me a negative 3 are the 5 and negative 8. So my equations for now would be 5x plus 5 and x minus 8. But because I multiplied by 2 at the beginning, the rule was that we learned before that you divide both by 2. Now, is 5 divisible by 2? Since the answer is no, it becomes the leading coefficient of that factor. So that would become 2x plus 5. Is the 8 divisible by 2? It sure is, so that becomes x minus 4. Now the next one, it is difference of 2 squares. Can you take the square root of 9? Yes. It's a subtraction, that's why it's difference. Can you take the square root of 1? Yes, you can. So we're going to make 2 parentheses. Square root of 9 is 3x and 3x. Square root of 1 is 1 and 1. 1 has to be positive and 1 negative. We did a lot of those problems and you're going to use that a lot in today's lesson. When we look for 8x squared and 20x, we need to see what's the greatest common factor. Now, 8x squared and 20x, 8 and 20 are both divisible by 4. One of them has an x2, the other one has an x1. What is the greatest amount of x's that you could take out? Well, it's just 1x. So I should be able to factor 4x. If I factor out the 4x, 8 divided by 4 is 2. Since it had x squared before, I'm taking out an x, so that's why it's just 2x. 20 divided by 4 would be 5, and I took out that x, so it becomes just 5. So if I were to go back and distribute and go 4x times 2x, 8x squared. 4x times 5, 20x. So let's look at the first example. What can I factor out from x cubed, 2x squared, and 15x? What do they all three have in common? They all have an x. When I factor out the x from x cubed, what do I have left over? X squared. When I factor out the x from 2x squared, I have a 2x left over. And when I factor out the x from the 15x, we have just a minus 15. Now, when we look at what's in the parentheses, it's a trinomial. And it goes back to what we did at the very beginning of these notes. Can that be any further factored? What are the factors of 15? Negative 15. And it's 1 and 15, 3 and 5. Now, I'm looking for a positive 2, so that means that my little number, my smaller number, has to be negative, my larger positive. So who gives me a summation of 2? Well, negative 5 and 3. So then that factors out. Just remember not to forget the x from up in the front. So that guy just comes down. So then that would be your answer right there. Now, in the next one, 2x to the fifth and 18y to the third. The most y's that you could take out from both would be y to the third, and they're both divisible by 2. So we're going to factor out 2y cubed. When I take out a 2y cubed from 2y to the fifth, I have y squared left. When I take out a 2y cubed from 18y cubed, I have a minus 9 left over. Now, are we done? Or could this still be factored? Well, if you do recall the difference of perfect squares, y squared minus 9, we could take the square root of 9. So that right there still becomes y plus 3 and y minus 3. Now, look at this one. There's 3 terms. We have 4x to the fourth minus 16x cubed plus 16x squared. Now, the most x's that I could factor out would be an x squared. 4, 16, and 16, they're all divisible by 4. So I should be able to factor out a 4x squared. When I do that, that 4x to the fourth now becomes just an x squared. 16x cubed, but we factor out the 4x squared, that becomes a 4x. And the 16x cubed becomes a 4. Now the question is, can x squared minus 4x plus 4 still be factored? Well, numbers that multiply to 4 and add up to a negative 4, 1 and 4, 2 and 2. Because it's a negative in the middle, they would both have to be negative. And who adds up to a negative 4? The 2 and 2. So my answer would be this. So we factored it, but that 4x squared still comes down. So sum of 2 cubes and difference of 2 cubes. The difference is what sign is there in the middle, a plus or a minus. And that's the only thing that goes different into the rest of the equations. So when we look at the problems, we have 4 where we're going to practice. We need to understand that the first term comes from the first number that you see, and the b to the third comes from the second. So the first one would be your a squared, and my second would be my b squared. B cubed, sorry. A cubed and b cubed. Now, we're wanting to take the cube root of these numbers. So we can figure out what number cubed gives you 8. Now, 8's an easy one. What gives you 8 would be 2 times 2 times 2. But in case you're not too sure, get your calculator, and we're going to have to plug it in there. Now, you're going to have to use the control key, which is the blue one, and the little key that has the little caret key. Or at least that's what they call it. It's underneath the equal sign. Once you do that, you're going to get something that looks like this. And the little box outside, you're going to have to put a 3 all the time, because that's the cube root that you're looking for. If we were talking about something else and you would change it, but for this lesson, it has to be a 3. In this case, we're looking for the cube root of 8, so I would plug in an 8. If I do this, the calculator should tell me it's 2. Now, since I'm taking the cube root of 8, and it's 2, that tells me that my a is 2. But now I'm going to take the cube root of 27. So once again, the number outside has to be 3. The number inside, just depending what you're looking for, cube root of 27 is 3. So going back to the top, because you took the cube root of 8, that is 2. But because it has x cubed, we would also need to put the x. 27 cubed, we said, was 3. So now we know who a and b are. And now we just need to base our equation for the answer based on the first equation. So it says a plus b. In that case, my a is 2x. My b is 3. And then the second parenthesis starts off with a squared, which means 2x times 2x, which is 4x squared. And then we're going to do minus, because that's what the formula says, a times b. So 2x times 3 would be 6x. And then your b squared, which is 3 times 3, which is 9. So that right there would be the answer for that one. And that's all you have to do. So let's look at the next one. A cubed is 64x to the third power. B cubed is a 1. Now if we take the cube root of 64 using the calculator, we should get 4x. The cube root of 1 is 1. Now this one has a subtraction, so now we're going to be using the second equation. So we have a minus b, which is 4x minus 1, and then a squared, well, my a is 4x. What's 4x times 4x? That would be 16x squared, and then plus a times b, which is 4x, and then b squared, which is 1. So we're going to try 2 more. So let's look at this first one. We have a cubed is just x cubed. My b cubed is going to be 64. So x cubed, if we take the cube root of x, it would just be x. Cube root of 64, we just did it in the previous problem, which was 4. So it's an addition one, so we're going to use the top one, which says a plus b, which means x plus 4, parentheses, a squared, which is x squared, and then minus, so make sure that's a minus, apologize, a squared minus 4 times x would be 4x, and then 4 times 4 would be 16. Now that right there would be your answer. Now the next one, a cubed and b cubed would be, well, if you really look at 16, can you take the cube root of 16? The answer should be no. Now we've already covered 2 cubed, which was 8. We've covered 3 cubed, which was 27. And we've covered 4 cubed so far, which is 64. Now, none of those numbers represent a 16, but how can I make that 16 into an 8? Only if I factor out a 2x to the second. Now, why am I factoring out an x to the second also? Well, because that is the most x's that you could take out. So that becomes x, 8x to the third, minus 125. Because 250 divided by 2 is 125, and the x squared has been taken out. So now that would be my a cubed and my b cubed. Now 8x cubed, the cube root of 8 is 2. Just don't forget the x. Cube root of 125 would be 5. And then we just substitute it in there, which would be 2x minus 5. And then your a squared would be 4x squared. We multiply them together, which makes it a plus 10x. And then we are doing b squared, which is 5 times 5, which is 25. Now, because we had this here, we need to bring it down and put it as part of the answer. So that's where we got that little guy from. Still part of the answer. So that would be it. Okay, this problem is going to be factored by grouping, and in mathematics, the symbols that we use for grouping are the parentheses. So we're going to group the first 2 things together and the second 2 things together. So we're going to look at the x cubed and the minus 3x squared. What do they have in common? What can I factor out for my first parentheses? Well, I could factor out an x squared. When I factor out the x squared, that x cubed becomes x. That negative x squared, when I factor out the x squared, it just becomes a minus 3. Okay, so we're done there. Let's look at the second parentheses. Negative 16x plus 48. Now, what can I factor out from there? Because it's a minus 16, I would be able to factor out a negative 16. When I factor out a negative 16 from negative 16x, the only thing you have left over is x. 48 divided by negative 16 would give me a negative 3. So, if you notice one thing, hopefully it's that both of your parentheses are the same. Now, that would be the first part of your answer. X minus 3 and x minus 3. Now, your second part of the answer comes from the two things that you factored out, which in this case is x squared minus 16. So that would be your next one, which is there. Now, x squared minus 16, can you take the square root of 16? You sure can, and it's 4. So you would have to factor it out, and that would be your answer right there. So we'd see the two parentheses need to be exactly the same. You factor out, you bring outside. Then you make a parentheses. If it's something that's factorable, like x squared minus 16, then you do it from there. Now let's try the next one. We're going to group the first two things and the second two things together. 3m cubed and minus m squared. What we could factor out is just the m squared. Once we do that, that 3m cubed becomes 3m. That m squared becomes a 1. Now, 3m minus 3, we could factor out a 3. So 9m becomes 3m. And that minus 3, since we're factoring out the 3, we'll have to put a minus 1. So anytime you factor exactly what the problem says, you need to put a 1. You can't put a 0. It has to be represented by a 1. So we look at both parentheses. Are they the same? Yes. Perfect. So then that would be my first part of the answer. And my second part would become from the two things that were factored out, which in this case is m squared plus 3. Now the last example 4 is factoring something that has a greater exponent than 2 or 3, which in this case would be x to the 4th. Now x to the 4th, we'll have to break it into two parentheses, which would have to have x squared and x squared, because when you multiply those together, that's how you get an x to the 4th. Can you take the square root of 16? Can you take the square root of 81? Is it a minus in the middle? So it's a difference of squares. So we'll have to have a plus 9 and a minus 9, and the square root of 16 would be 4 and 4. Now, we might think that this is our final answer, but when we look at the second parentheses, 4x squared minus 9, we should be able to factor that one a little bit further. So the first one stays the same. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 9 would be 3. So that would be my final answer. And the last example would be 2p to the 8th plus 10p to the 5th plus 12p squared. The most that I could factor out from here would be 2p squared. So we're going to head and do that. When I do that, that 2p to the 8th becomes p to the 6th. The 10p to the 5th becomes a 5p to the 3rd. That 12p squared becomes just a 6. Now we're going to ignore what we factored out for right now. So ignore the front. Now, how can I get a p to the 6 when I'm multiplying two parentheses? I would have to have a p to the 3rd and a p to the 3rd. Now that would make me that p to the 6. Now it's just the same thing that we were talking about previously. What two numbers multiply to 6 but adds up to 5? And it would be 2 and 3. So I would have plus 2 plus 3. And make sure you bring down what you had factored out at the beginning. So that is your lesson. If you have questions, make sure you have them for me on Friday. And we'll see you later.